1980, Appalachian, the Whaley Widow, sent 23 wolves after 2 soldiers who burned her Moonshine barn. The most terrifying act of vengeance in modern Appalachian history, and the most devastating demonstration that the old ways of mountain justice had not disappeared with the coming of the 20th century. When an elderly widow released a pack of wolf dogs she had bred for decades to hunt down and kill the men who had burned her Moonshine barn with her grandson inside. This is the true story of the Whaley Widow. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Mingo County, West Virginia, in the spring of 1980, in a hollow so isolated that the modern world had barely touched it despite the calendar claiming otherwise. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before West Virginia was a state, who had never fully accepted the authority of a government they viewed as foreign and hostile, who maintained traditions that outsiders believed had died generations before. The people who settled these hollows came seeking freedom from interference, and their descendants in 1980 maintained that spirit through decades of conflict with revenue agents, federal marshals, and every other representative of an authority they had never recognized. You see, in Mingo County during the years of our story, the moonshine trade that outsiders believed had ended with prohibition continued to flourish in hollows where the terrain made enforcement nearly impossible and where the economic realities of Appalachian poverty made illegal whiskey one of the few reliable sources of income. The families who ran these operations were not criminals in any meaningful sense of the word, but were carrying on traditions that predated the laws that made their work illegal, were providing for their families in the only way the mountains had ever allowed, were maintaining a way of life that the government seemed determined to destroy. The woman at the center of our story was known throughout the Kentucky and West Virginia border country as the Whaley Widow, though her given name was Delilah Whaley, and she had been born Delilah May Combs in 1912 in a cabin on the upper reaches of Pigeon Creek. She had married Ezekiel Whaley when she was 17, had borne him 8 children, of whom 6 survived to adulthood, had buried him in 1965 when a mining accident took him along with 14 other men, and had spent the 15 years since his death running the Moonshine operation that had supported their family for 3 generations. That's right. Delilah Whaley was 68 years old in the spring of 1980, a small woman whose body had been bent by decades of mountain labor, but whose eyes retained a sharpness that observers found unsettling, a clarity that suggested she saw more than most people and remembered everything she saw. She had white hair that she kept pulled back in a bun, hands that were gnarled from arthritis but still capable of the precise work that moonshine production required, a voice that had grown soft with age, but that could still carry across a hollow when she needed to be heard. Her operation was modest by the standards of commercial illegal distilling, but substantial by the standards of traditional mountain moonshine. She ran 3 copper stills that her husband had built before his death, produced perhaps 50 gallons of whiskey per week during the active season, sold her product to a network of buyers who had been purchasing Whaley whiskey since before Delilah was born. The quality of her product was legendary, the result of techniques passed down through generations, and of the particular water that flowed from springs on her property, water that old-timers claimed had qualities that no other source could match. The operation was housed in a barn that stood a quarter mile from her cabin, a structure that her husband had built specifically to conceal the stills from aerial observation, its roof designed to disperse the smoke that the fires produced, its location chosen to take advantage of natural features that would hide it from anyone who did not know exactly where to look. The barn had survived decades of enforcement efforts, had never been discovered by the revenue agents who periodically swept through the county, had become a point of pride for the Whaley family, and a symbol of their ability to maintain their way of life, despite the government's efforts to end it. But the feature of the Whaley property that distinguished it from every other moonshine operation in the region was the pack. Delilah Whaley had been breeding wolf-dog hybrids for more than 40 years, crossing domestic dogs with wolves that still roamed the most remote sections of the Appalachian wilderness, selecting for size and strength and intelligence and a particular quality that she called the hunt, but that others might have described as controlled ferocity. The animals she produced were not pets and were not guard dogs in any conventional sense, but were something else entirely. Creatures that combined the loyalty of domestic dogs with the predatory instincts of wolves, that could be controlled by someone who understood them, but that were dangerous beyond measure to anyone who did not. The pack numbered 23 animals at the time of our story, ranging from grizzled veterans who had been with Delilah for more than a decade, to young animals who were still learning the discipline that membership in the pack required. They lived in a compound that Delilah had built on her property, a fenced area that contained shelters and feeding stations, and the infrastructure necessary to maintain such a large group of predators. The compound was located behind her cabin, positioned so that anyone approaching her property would have to pass within sight of the animals, would see the yellow eyes watching from the shadows, would understand without being told that the Whaley property was protected by something more dangerous than locks or guns. The animals were known throughout the region simply as the wolves, a name that was not technically accurate since they were hybrids rather than pure wolves, but that captured something essential about their nature. Stories about the wolves had circulated through the mountain communities for decades, tales of their size and their ferocity, of the intelligence that seemed almost supernatural, of the absolute loyalty they showed to Delilah and the absolute hostility they showed to anyone she identified as an enemy. Some of these stories were exaggerated, the product of fear and imagination working together to create legends. Others were entirely accurate. Delilah's relationship with the wolves was the subject of endless speculation among those who knew her. She seemed to communicate with them in ways that went beyond ordinary commands, seemed to understand their thoughts, and to make her thoughts understood to them, seemed to have forged a bond that transcended the normal relationship between human and animal. She had raised most of them from birth, had bottle-fed the pups whose mothers could not nurse them, had spent hours every day for more than 4 decades learning their ways and teaching them hers. The result was a pack that functioned as an extension of her will, that would do things at her direction that no ordinary dogs would do, that represented a weapon unlike anything else in the mountains. The training methods she employed were known only to herself and to the few family members she had trusted enough to share them. The process began when the animals were pups, the earliest days of their lives spent in constant contact with Delilah, their developing minds imprinting on her presence in ways that would shape their behavior for the rest of their lives. She handled them constantly, spoke to them in a low voice that they learned to associate with safety and approval, established herself as the center of their world before they were old enough to understand what that meant. As the animals grew, the training became more sophisticated. She taught them to respond to hand signals that allowed her to direct their movements silently, gestures that an observer might not even recognize as commands, but that the wolves understood perfectly. She taught them to differentiate between people she accepted and people she did not, to respond with friendliness to the former and with hostility to the latter, to read her body language for cues about how to behave in any situation. The hunting training was the most complex and the most dangerous phase of the animals' education. She would take them into the woods and direct them to track game, would observe how they worked together, and correct behaviors that interfered with pack coordination. She taught them to wait for her signal before attacking, to hold position even when their instincts screamed at them to pursue, to release and withdraw when she commanded, regardless of how the hunt was progressing. The discipline she instilled was absolute, the product of countless hours of work that had continued every day for more than 40 years. The pack's hierarchy was carefully maintained with Delilah at the apex. The animals understood that she was the ultimate authority, that the alpha position in their society was occupied by a human rather than by another wolf. This understanding was essential to her ability to control them, since a pack that recognized a wolf as its leader might obey that leader rather than her in situations where the two authorities conflicted. She had learned through decades of trial and error how to maintain her position, how to assert dominance without provoking the challenges that might have disrupted the pack's structure. The household that Delilah maintained in 1980 consisted of herself and her grandson, a boy named Samuel, who was 12 years old and who was the son of her youngest daughter, Martha, who had died of cancer 3 years before. Samuel had been sent to live with his grandmother after his mother's death, his father having disappeared years before, and no other relative being willing or able to take him. The boy had adapted to mountain life with a resilience that pleased his grandmother, had learned to help with the Moonshine operation, had developed a relationship with the wolves that suggested he had inherited some of his grandmother's gift for understanding them. Samuel was a quiet boy, small for his age, with dark hair and eyes that seemed too large for his face. A child whose life had been marked by losses that no 12-year-old should have to bear, but who had found in his grandmother's hollow a stability that his earlier years had lacked. He helped with the chores that the property required, gathered firewood and carried water, and performed the countless small tasks that mountain life demanded. He spent hours with the wolves, sitting in their compound and learning their ways, earning their trust through patience and consistency, becoming accepted by the pack in ways that few humans ever achieved. The events that would lead to tragedy began in the spring of 1980, when a new initiative by federal and state authorities targeted illegal distilling operations throughout the Appalachian region. The initiative was called Operation Mountain Thunder, a coordinated effort involving the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the West Virginia State Police, and National Guard units that had been called up to provide additional manpower. The operation's stated goal was to eliminate illegal distilling in the target region, to destroy the infrastructure that supported it, and to arrest and prosecute those responsible for its continuation. The reality of Operation Mountain Thunder was more complicated than its official justification suggested. The operation was driven partly by genuine law enforcement concerns, but also by political considerations that had nothing to do with illegal whiskey. Politicians seeking to demonstrate their commitment to law and order had pushed for a high-profile crackdown that would generate headlines and photographs, that would show voters that the government was taking action against lawlessness in regions that had long been associated with resistance to federal authority. The operation's success would be measured not in gallons of whiskey seized or criminals convicted, but in the visibility of the enforcement action itself. The National Guard units that participated in Operation Mountain Thunder were not professional soldiers, but were weekend warriors, men who held civilian jobs and who gathered once a month for training that prepared them for emergencies that most of them would never face. The units called up for the operation included men from across West Virginia, some of whom had family connections to the very communities they were being sent to police, others of whom had no understanding of mountain culture and no sympathy for the people whose lives they were about to disrupt. The two guardsmen who would become the focus of our story were named Vernon Crawford and Dale Tackett, both in their mid-20s, both from the flatland sections of the state where moonshine was a curiosity rather than a way of life, both possessed of an arrogance that their limited military training had done nothing to temper. Crawford was the unofficial leader of the pair, a man whose size and aggression had made him dominant in every group he had ever joined, whose approach to the operation reflected a belief that the mountain people were criminals who deserved whatever treatment they received. Tackett was a follower, a man whose own impulses were cruel, but who lacked the initiative to act on them without someone else's leadership, who found in Crawford a model for the behavior he wished he had the courage to display on his own. The Whaley property was identified as a target early in the operation's planning, the result of intelligence gathered over years of failed enforcement efforts. The location of the Moonshine barn was known to the authorities. The evidence of the operation's scale had been documented by surveillance that Delilah had never detected. The decision to raid the property had been made at levels far above the guardsmen who would carry it out. Crawford and Tackett were assigned to a team that would approach the property from the east, would secure the barn while other teams secured the cabin and the surrounding area, would destroy the stills and seize any whiskey they found. The raid was scheduled for the early morning hours of May 15, 1980, the timing chosen to maximize the element of surprise and to catch anyone at the property before they could hide evidence or flee. The team that Crawford and Tackett belonged to consisted of 6 guardsmen, all of them young, all of them inexperienced, all of them approaching the operation with an excitement that reflected their failure to understand what they were actually doing. They had been briefed on the wolves, had been warned that the property was protected by dangerous animals, had been told to use whatever force was necessary to neutralize the threat the animals posed. What happened in the early morning hours of May 15, 1980, would be disputed for years afterward. the official account differing dramatically from the account that the mountain community believed and that the evidence seemed to support. The official account claimed that the guardsmen approached the property according to plan, that they encountered resistance that required them to use force, that the fire that destroyed the Moonshine barn was an accident caused by the destruction of the stills. The community's account told a different story entirely, according to the witnesses who would later provide testimony that no official investigation ever acknowledged. Crawford and Tackett separated from their team shortly after the raid began, moving toward the Moonshine barn while the other guardsmen secured the cabin where Delilah was sleeping. The two men reached the barn without encountering resistance, found it empty of people, but containing the stills and supplies that they had been sent to destroy. What they did next would transform a law enforcement operation into a crime that demanded response. Rather than securing the barn and waiting for the team to complete its work, Crawford and Tackett decided to destroy the structure immediately, to burn it, rather than simply disabling the stills it contained. Their motivation was never clearly established, though the community believed it reflected a desire to inflict maximum damage on the Whaley family, to go beyond the operation's official objectives, and to punish people whom Crawford and Tackett viewed as deserving of punishment. They gathered accelerant from the supplies they had brought, doused the barn's interior, and set the fire that would consume the structure within minutes. What they did not know, what they could not have known, given the chaos of the raid and the darkness of the pre-dawn hour, was that Samuel Whaley was inside the barn when they set the fire. The boy had been sleeping in a loft that his grandmother had built for him, a space where he sometimes stayed when the weather was warm and when he wanted to be close to the wolves whose compound was visible from the loft's window. He had been there when the raid began, had hidden when he heard the approaching footsteps, had remained silent in the hope that whoever had come would leave without discovering him. The fire that Crawford and Tackett set spread with a speed that reflected the accelerant they had used, consuming the dry wood of the barn's structure with a ferocity that left no time for escape. Samuel's screams were heard by the other guardsmen, who had by then secured Delilah at the cabin, but the fire was too intense to allow any rescue attempt. The boy died in the flames, his body so thoroughly burned that identification would later require dental records, his last moments spent in a terror that no 12-year-old should ever have to experience. Delilah Whaley heard her grandson's screams from the cabin, where the guardsmen held her, heard them stop with an abruptness that told her everything she needed to know, felt something inside her change in that moment in ways that nothing would ever change back. The woman who had spent 68 years living according to the mountain code, who had survived poverty and loss and the death of her husband, and the grinding difficulty of maintaining a life in terrain that seemed designed to defeat human habitation, who had maintained her humanity through everything that the world had thrown at her, felt that humanity began to recede, replaced by something older and colder and more absolute. The official response to Samuel's death was minimal. The investigation conducted by the authorities concluded that the boy's presence in the barn was unknown to the guardsmen who had set the fire, that his death was an accident that no one had intended, that the men responsible bore no criminal culpability for what had happened. Crawford and Tackett were not charged with any crime, were not even disciplined within the guard structure, were allowed to return to their civilian lives as though they had done nothing wrong. The message that this response sent to the mountain community was clear. The life of a 12-year-old boy meant nothing when weighed against the convenience of the state. Delilah Whaley buried her grandson in the church cemetery 3 days after his death, laid his small body in ground beside his mother and his grandfather, and the generations of Whaleys who had lived and died in these mountains. The funeral was attended by dozens of people from throughout the region, neighbors and customers and relatives who came to pay their respects and to witness the grief of a woman who had lost the last person in the world she had left to love. She received their condolences with a composure that some found admirable and others found disturbing, a stillness that suggested not the absence of emotion, but its concentration into something too intense for ordinary expression. The wolves knew that something had changed. The animals who had been part of Delilah's life for more than 4 decades sensed the shift in their mistress's demeanor, responded to it with the alertness that reflected their own understanding of what loss and fury meant. They gathered around her when she visited their compound, pressed against her as though trying to provide comfort, watched her with eyes that seemed to be waiting for something, ready for whatever she might ask of them. The planning began immediately, though Delilah gave no outward sign of what she was preparing. She spent the days after Samuel's funeral gathering information, learning the names and locations of the men who had set the fire that killed her grandson, mapping their movements and their habits with the same patience she had always applied to the challenges that mountain life presented. The community provided whatever assistance she requested. The same network that had protected her Moonshine operation for decades, now redirecting its capabilities toward a different purpose. Crawford and Tackett had returned to their homes in the flatland section of the state, believing that their participation in Operation Mountain Thunder was complete and that whatever consequences might flow from Samuel's death would never reach them. They had dismissed the boy's death as an unfortunate accident, had felt no remorse for their role in causing it, had resumed their ordinary lives with an ease that reflected their conviction that what happened in the mountains stayed in the mountains, that the primitive people who lived there had no capacity to reach them in the civilized world below. They were wrong. The method that Delilah chose reflected both the resources she had available and the message she intended to send. She would not shoot Crawford and Tackett, would not poison them, would not use any of the methods that other mountain avengers had employed throughout the region's history. She would send the wolves, would release the pack that she had spent 40 years breeding and training, would demonstrate that the death of her grandson would be answered in a manner that no one would ever forget. The logistics of what she planned were complex but within her capabilities. The wolves could not simply be released and expected to find their targets on their own. They had to be transported to the vicinity of the victims' homes, had to be directed toward the specific individuals she wanted them to kill, had to be controlled throughout the operation in ways that prevented them from harming anyone else. The task required knowledge that only Delilah possessed and assistance that the community was willing to provide. The first killing came 6 weeks after Samuel's death, on the night of June 28, 1980. Crawford lived in a small house on the outskirts of a town called Ripley, a structure that sat on a lot bordered by woods that provided cover for approaches that no one in the flatlands would think to guard against. Delilah had been transported to the area by relatives who asked no questions about her purpose, had been dropped off with 5 of her wolves at a location 3 miles from Crawford's house, had made her way through terrain that was unfamiliar, but that presented no challenge to someone who had spent 68 years navigating the mountains. The wolves moved through the night with the silent efficiency that their breeding had produced, following Delilah's directions with an obedience that reflected decades of training and a bond that went beyond anything ordinary handlers achieved with ordinary dogs. They reached Crawford's property shortly after midnight, spread out around the house in a pattern that Delilah had established through hand signals they understood, and waited for the moment when their mistress would give them permission to do what their instincts demanded. Crawford emerged from his house at approximately 2 in the morning, responding to sounds he had heard in his yard, carrying a shotgun that he believed would be sufficient to deal with whatever animal had disturbed his sleep. He never had a chance to use it. The wolves came at him from multiple directions simultaneously, the coordinated attack reflecting the pack hunting behavior that their wild ancestors had perfected over millions of years. The first wolf hit him from behind, knocking him to the ground before he could bring the shotgun to bear. The others followed within seconds, their jaws closing on limbs and throat and face with a force that no human could resist. The attack lasted less than a minute, but seemed to Crawford to last forever, the pain of the wolves' teeth tearing into his flesh, combined with the terror of understanding what was happening to him. He screamed, but the wolves had already damaged his throat in ways that reduced his screams to gurgling sounds that did not carry far. He tried to fight, but there were too many of them, and they were too strong and too fast for any resistance to matter. He died on his own front lawn, his body so savaged that the responding officers would initially be unable to determine what had killed him. Delilah called the wolves off when the killing was complete, gathered them with the same hand signals she had used to direct the attack, and disappeared into the woods before anyone in the neighboring houses could respond to the sounds they had heard. She and the wolves made their way back to the pickup point, were collected by the relatives who had transported her, were back in Mingo County before dawn broke over the scene of devastation she had left behind. The investigation into Crawford's death was extensive, but ultimately futile. The forensic evidence made clear that he had been killed by some kind of animal or animals, the tooth marks and claw marks and the patterns of damage, consistent with an attack by large predators. But the investigators could not identify what kind of animals had been responsible, could not explain how such animals had come to be in a suburban yard in the flatlands of West Virginia, could not develop any theory that made sense of what they had found. The case was classified as an animal attack of unknown origin, the investigation suspended without resolution. Tackett learned of Crawford's death through the news coverage that followed, the reports describing an attack so savage that officials were unwilling to release details to the public. He felt the first stirrings of fear when he heard the reports, the connection to Operation Mountain Thunder, and the Whaley property occurring to him immediately, even though no official source had suggested any link. He increased security around his own home, purchased additional firearms, told himself that whatever had happened to Crawford could not happen to him, that he would be prepared for any threat that might emerge from the mountains. His preparations were inadequate. The second killing came 3 weeks later, on the night of July 19, 1980. Tackett lived in a trailer on the edge of a small town called Spencer, a location that he believed was too remote and too well guarded for anyone to approach without detection. He had acquired 2 dogs of his own since Crawford's death, had set up lights around his property that illuminated the approaches, had kept a loaded rifle within reach at all times. None of it mattered. Delilah arrived at the vicinity of Tackett's property with 18 wolves, nearly the entire pack, the numbers reflecting both the difficulty of the target and her determination that this killing would be even more thorough than the first. The wolves spread out through the woods that surrounded the trailer, encircling the property in a pattern that left no direction unguarded, waiting for the opportunity that their mistress knew would eventually come. The opportunity came shortly after midnight, when Tackett's dogs began to bark at something they had detected in the darkness beyond the lights. Tackett emerged from his trailer to investigate, rifle in hand, confident that whatever was out there would retreat when confronted by an armed man and 2 guard dogs. His dogs ran toward the tree line, barking furiously at the threat they sensed but could not see. They never came back. The wolves took the dogs first, silently and efficiently, eliminating the only warning system that Tackett had. Then they turned their attention to Tackett himself, emerging from the darkness in a wave that the lights he had installed only made more terrifying, their yellow eyes reflecting the glare as they moved toward the man who had helped kill Samuel Whaley. Tackett managed to fire his rifle twice before the wolves reached him, the shots going wild as panic destroyed whatever aim he might have had. Then they were on him. The same coordinated attack that had killed Crawford, the same overwhelming force that no single human could resist. His screams were louder than Crawford's had been, his trailer's remote location meaning that no neighbors were close enough to hear, his death coming slowly as the wolves tore him apart in the yard where he had believed himself safe. Delilah watched from the edge of the woods, her face illuminated briefly by the lights that Tackett had installed, her expression showing nothing that any observer could have read. When the killing was complete, she called the wolves to her, gathered the pack that had served her purpose, and began the long journey back to the mountains that had always been her home. The body she left behind would not be discovered for 3 days, when Tackett's failure to report for work prompted a welfare check that revealed a scene of carnage that the responding officers would never forget. The investigation into Tackett's death immediately connected it to Crawford's, the similarities too obvious to ignore. Both men had participated in Operation Mountain Thunder. Both had been assigned to the team that had raided the Whaley property. Both had been present when the Moonshine barn was burned and Samuel Whaley had died. Both had been killed by what appeared to be the same kind of animal attack, their bodies savaged in ways that suggested large predators working in coordinated packs. The forensic analysis of both crime scenes was extensive, involving experts from multiple agencies who attempted to determine what kind of animals had been responsible for the attacks. The tooth marks and claw patterns were consistent with large canids, either wolves or wolf-dog hybrids, the size of the individual marks suggesting animals significantly larger than any domestic dog breed. The patterns of the attacks suggested coordinated group behavior, multiple animals working together in ways that reflected pack-hunting strategies rather than the random aggression of feral dogs. The blood evidence told its own story. Both victims had been attacked by multiple animals simultaneously, the blood spatter patterns indicating that bites had come from different directions at the same time. Crawford had been bitten by at least 5 different animals, Tackett by at least 8. The coordination required for such attacks went beyond anything investigators had seen in cases involving feral dogs or other wild animals, suggesting training of some kind, direction by someone who understood pack dynamics and could control them. Hair samples collected at both scenes were analyzed by wildlife experts who concluded that they came from wolf-dog hybrids rather than pure wolves or pure dogs. The genetic markers suggested animals that were approximately 70% wolf, 30% domestic dog, a ratio that was consistent with the breeding program that Delilah Whaley was known to maintain. But proving that the specific animals on her property had committed the attacks required evidence that the investigation could not obtain. The connection to the Whaley property and the wolves that protected it was obvious to investigators who had any knowledge of the mountain community. Delilah Whaley became the primary suspect in both killings, her motive clear and her means apparently available. But proving her involvement proved impossible. She had alibis for both nights in question, provided by family members who would swear to her presence in Mingo County at the times when the killings occurred hundreds of miles away. The wolves on her property were examined by veterinarians who found no evidence that they had been involved in attacks on humans. The investigation produced suspicion, but no evidence, theories, but no proof. The federal authorities who had organized Operation Mountain Thunder found themselves confronting an outcome they had not anticipated. 2 of the guardsmen who had participated in the operation were dead, killed in circumstances that strongly suggested retaliation for what had happened to Samuel Whaley. The evidence pointed toward Delilah Whaley and her wolves, but the evidence was insufficient to support prosecution. The authorities faced a choice between pursuing a case they could not win and accepting that the mountain community had administered its own justice in response to the death of a 12-year-old boy. They chose to accept it. The investigations into the deaths of Crawford and Tackett were officially suspended, classified as animal attacks of unknown origin, the files closed without charges being filed against anyone. The decision reflected both the practical impossibility of prosecution and a recognition, perhaps, that what had happened to Samuel Whaley deserved some response. That the men who had burned a barn with a child inside had received a fate that the legal system would never have provided. Delilah Whaley lived for another 11 years after the killings, dying in 1991 at the age of 79, her death coming peacefully in the cabin where she had spent most of her life. She never spoke publicly about what she had done, never confirmed or denied the rumors that circulated through the mountain community and beyond. She maintained the wolves until her death, the pack's numbers declining as the older animals died, and she chose not to breed replacements, the last of them dying within a year of her own death, as though they could not survive without the woman who had created them. Her grave lies in the church cemetery beside her husband and her daughter and her grandson, the 4 of them united in death as they had been connected in life. The inscription on her stone gives no hint of what she did in the summer of 1980, bearing only her name and her dates and a phrase that the community chose to remember her by. She protected her own. The words acknowledge her role as defender of her family, without specifying the means she had employed, a memorial that those who know the story understand, and those who do not can interpret innocently. The cabin where she lived still stands, maintained by descendants who use it occasionally, but who have not attempted to restore the Moonshine operation that once supported the family. The compound where the wolves lived has been dismantled, the fences removed and the shelters torn down, the area returning to the forest that surrounds it. But the location is still known to some in the community, still pointed out to those who ask about the Whaley Widow and the wolves that did her bidding. Samuel's grave is maintained with particular care, the stone cleaned regularly, and flowers placed on the anniversary of his death each May. The inscription on his stone is simple, bearing his name and his dates and the words, "Taken too soon." The community that could not protect him in life has tried to honor him in death, has made his grave a place of remembrance that acknowledges the tragedy of what happened to him and the response that his death provoked. The legal aftermath of the Whaley case was significant, despite the failure to prosecute anyone for the killings. The deaths of Crawford and Tackett prompted a review of Operation Mountain Thunder and the tactics it had employed. A review that concluded the operation had been poorly planned and badly executed, that the death of Samuel Whaley reflected failures at multiple levels of command, that the guardsmen involved had received inadequate training and inadequate supervision. The review recommended changes in how such operations were conducted in the future, changes that may have prevented similar tragedies from occurring. The broader impact of the case extended beyond the specific reforms it prompted. The story of the Whaley Widow and her wolves entered the folklore of the region, becoming a cautionary tale about the consequences of underestimating the mountain people and their capacity for response. Law enforcement officials who operated in Appalachia in the decades that followed were aware of the story, understood its implications, approached their work with a caution that reflected the knowledge that the communities they policed had their own ways of achieving justice. The wolves themselves became legendary, their role in the killings transforming them from unusual animals into something approaching mythological creatures. Stories circulated about their size and their intelligence, about the supernatural bond they had shared with the woman who bred them, about the coordinated attacks that had killed 2 armed men with military training. Some of these stories were exaggerated, the product of fear and imagination working together. Others were entirely accurate, the reality of what the wolves had done requiring no embellishment. The songs that emerged from the Whaley case were unlike any others in the Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies and lyrics that captured something that earlier songs had never had to address. The most popular ballad told the story from beginning to end, from the Moonshine operation and the wolves, through Operation Mountain Thunder and Samuel's death, to the killings that had followed and the investigation that had failed to produce any charges. The first verse described Delilah Whaley as she had been before the tragedy, an elderly widow maintaining a way of life that her family had practiced for generations, her wolves the guardians of a property that the authorities had never been able to successfully raid. The melody was gentle, almost nostalgic, suggesting a world that was about to be destroyed by forces it could not control. The second verse described the wolves themselves, the 40 years of breeding that had produced them, the bond between the pack and the woman who had created them, the yellow eyes that watched from the shadows, and the teeth that could kill. This verse had a darker quality, the melody suggesting something dangerous beneath the surface, something that would eventually be released. The third verse described Operation Mountain Thunder, the politicians and the guardsmen, and the decision to raid the Whaley property, the approach in the pre-dawn darkness and the fire that would change everything. The melody became ominous here, the notes suggesting disaster approaching with the inevitability of gravity. The fourth verse described Samuel's death, the boy trapped in the burning barn, his screams heard by a grandmother who could not reach him, his body consumed by flames that men had set without knowing or caring that a child was inside. This was the verse that brought tears to listeners' eyes, the melody dropping into a minor key that seemed to carry the weight of a loss too terrible to bear. The fifth verse described the investigation that had cleared the men responsible, the decision that Samuel's death was an accident for which no one would be held accountable, the message that decisions sent to a community that had always known the government viewed them as less than human. The melody here was angry, the rhythm quickening, as the injustice built toward its inevitable response. The sixth verse described the planning, the grandmother gathering her wolves and preparing for vengeance, the community providing the assistance she needed without asking questions whose answers they did not want to know. The melody became almost martial here, suggesting purpose and determination, an old woman transformed into something that her enemies should have learned to fear. The seventh verse described Crawford's death, the wolves emerging from the darkness, the coordinated attack that left him dead in his own yard, the disappearance of the woman and her pack before anyone could respond. The melody was brutal here, the rhythm mimicking the violence it described, the notes suggesting teeth and claws and the screams of a man who had never expected to pay for what he had done. The eighth verse described Tackett's death, the precautions he had taken and their failure, the 18 wolves that had surrounded his trailer, the killing that had been even more thorough than the first. The melody continued its brutal quality, the violence building to a climax that left no doubt about the fate of men who had killed a child and believed they would escape unpunished. The ninth verse described the investigation that had followed, the suspicion that had pointed toward Delilah Whaley, the failure to gather evidence sufficient for prosecution, the decision to close the cases without charges. The melody became almost sardonic here, suggesting the futility of pursuing justice through official channels when the mountain community had already achieved it through means of its own. The final verse described Delilah's remaining years, her death in the cabin where she had lived most of her life, her burial beside the grandson she had avenged, the legacy she had left for those who would remember. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that even terrible deeds can find their proper ending, that even the fury of a grandmother must eventually rest. Musicians who performed this ballad reported that audiences responded with a complexity that reflected the story's moral ambiguity. There was horror at the method Delilah had employed, the savage violence of the wolf attacks disturbing even to those who believed her cause was just. But there was also satisfaction at the punishment of men who had killed a child and escaped accountability, admiration for a grandmother who had refused to accept that her grandson's death would go unanswered. The song did not try to resolve these conflicting responses, but simply presented them, letting listeners find their own way through the moral maze the story created. Another song focused specifically on the wolves, describing their breeding and their training, the relationship they had with the woman who had created them, the loyalty that had made them willing to kill at her command. This song portrayed the wolves sympathetically, as creatures who were doing what their nature demanded, whose violence was not cruelty, but simply the expression of instincts that Delilah had shaped toward her purpose. The song asked listeners to consider whether the wolves were responsible for what they had done, or whether that responsibility lay entirely with the woman who had directed them. A third song told the story from Samuel's perspective, imagining his life in the hollow with his grandmother, his relationship with the wolves, his death in the burning barn. This song was the most mournful of the three, its melody barely more than a whisper, its lyrics describing a child who deserved better than the fate he received. Musicians reported that this song was difficult to perform because audiences found it too painful to hear. The image of a 12-year-old dying in flames while his grandmother listened too terrible to contemplate. A fourth song addressed the authorities who had organized Operation Mountain Thunder, examining the decisions that had led to Samuel's death and the decisions that had protected the men responsible. This song was more political than the others, its criticism of government overreach and official indifference providing a framework for understanding why the mountain community had responded as it did. The song suggested that the killings were not merely personal vengeance, but a form of resistance to a system that had never valued the lives of mountain people. A fifth song focused on the investigation, imagining the frustration of officials who knew what had happened but could not prove it, who faced a wall of silence that the mountain community had maintained for generations. This song had an almost ironic quality, its melody suggesting the futility of pursuing evidence that would never be found, of seeking witnesses who would never speak, of trying to impose official justice on a community that had already achieved its own. The historians who have studied the Whaley case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to government overreach, arguing that the killings represented a response to an operation that had violated fundamental principles of proportionality and respect for human life. The death of Samuel Whaley was not merely a tragedy, but was a crime committed under color of law, and the community's response reflected its understanding that no official remedy would ever be provided. Others have focused on the role of the wolves, examining how Delilah's decades of breeding and training had created an instrument of violence that no other mountain avenger had ever possessed. The wolves represented a unique capability, a method of killing that was both effective and deniable, that allowed an elderly woman to reach enemies she could never have confronted directly. The case demonstrated that the weapons of vengeance were not limited to guns and knives and poison, that creativity and patience could produce capabilities that conventional analysis would never anticipate. The psychological analysis has examined Delilah's state of mind, noting that the loss of her grandson appeared to have triggered a transformation that went beyond ordinary grief. The woman who had spent decades as a healer and provider became something else entirely after Samuel's death, a figure whose sole purpose was the punishment of the men who had killed him. This transformation reflected the depth of her attachment to the boy and the magnitude of the wrong that his death represented. The sociological analysis has examined the community's role in enabling the killings, noting that Delilah could not have succeeded without assistance that the mountain network provided. The transportation, the intelligence, the alibis that made prosecution impossible, all of these required cooperation from people who understood what Delilah intended and who chose to help rather than to interfere. The community's complicity reflected a consensus that her cause was just, that the men who had killed Samuel deserved what they received, that the state's failure to provide justice made the community's provision of it necessary. The legal analysis has examined the investigation's failure, noting that the evidence against Delilah was strong, but not conclusive. The connection between the victims and the Whaley property, the availability of the wolves, the motive that Samuel's death had provided, all of these pointed toward Delilah as the perpetrator. But the physical evidence could not prove that her wolves had committed the attacks, and the alibis that her family provided created reasonable doubt that any jury would have had to consider. The case demonstrated the limits of the legal system's ability to prosecute crimes committed by communities that were determined to protect their own. You see, what Delilah Whaley did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. She killed 2 men using animals she had trained for the purpose, planned and executed the killings with a sophistication that reflected decades of preparation, escaped prosecution only because the evidence against her could not meet the standard required for conviction. The fact that her victims had participated in her grandson's death does not eliminate the fact that she took 2 human lives in response to 1, and yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that killing is wrong. Her grandson had been burned alive in a barn that guardsmen had set on fire, had died screaming while his grandmother listened from a distance she could not cross, had been killed by men who faced no consequences for what they had done. The system that was supposed to provide justice had instead protected the men who had killed Samuel, had made clear through its inaction that the life of a mountain child meant nothing when weighed against the interests of the state. The story challenges us to consider what alternatives Delilah might have pursued. The men who killed her grandson were protected by a system that would never hold them accountable, that had already concluded their actions were not criminal despite the death they had caused. Had Delilah accepted this verdict? Had she waited for justice that would never come? Samuel's death would have remained unanswered, another tragedy in a region that had experienced too many tragedies, another child whose life was worth less than the convenience of authorities who had never viewed his people as fully human. The question of proportionality haunts this story as it haunts all such narratives. 1 child killed, 2 men killed in response. Was the response proportionate? The answer depends on what we believe Samuel represented. If he was merely an individual, a single child whose death was tragic but whose life was not worth more than any other, then the response might seem proportionate. If we consider the manner of the response, the savage violence of the wolf attacks, the terror that the victims must have experienced, the question becomes more complex. The wolves add a dimension to this story that no other account of mountain vengeance possesses. They were not merely weapons, but were creatures with their own natures, their own instincts, their own capacity for violence that Delilah had shaped but not created. Using them to kill raised questions that using guns or poison would not have raised, questions about the relationship between human intention and animal action, about responsibility for violence that was directed but not directly performed. The descendants of Delilah Whaley still live in the mountains of West Virginia, carrying memories passed down through generations about what their ancestor did and why. Family stories speak of Delilah with a reverence that reflects both her role as grandmother and her role as avenger, the 2 identities inseparable in the memory of those who knew her. She is remembered as a woman who loved her grandson beyond measure and who proved that love through actions that most people could not have imagined, much less performed. The site where the Moonshine barn stood is still known to those who seek it out. The ruins of the foundation visible beneath the vegetation that has grown over them in the decades since the fire. Some visitors leave small tokens at the site, acknowledgements of Samuel's death and the response it provoked, markers of a story that refuses to be forgotten. The location carries a weight that those who visit report feeling, a sense of tragedy and fury that lingers in the air. The story of the Whaley Widow endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of love between generations, of a grandmother's determination to protect and avenge the grandson who was all she had left in the world. It is the story of power and its limits, of an elderly woman who proved that the state's monopoly on violence was not as complete as the state believed, that creativity and patience and 40 years of breeding wolves could create capabilities that conventional power could not anticipate or defeat. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at Samuel's grave, to read the inscription that says he was taken too soon, to feel the weight of a story that transformed a grandmother into a legend? Would you seek out the ruins of the Moonshine barn? Would you walk through the hollow where the wolves once waited? Would you try to understand how a woman becomes capable of what Delilah Whaley did, and what that transformation costs? The journey to Mingo County is easier now than it was in 1980. The roads improved, and the connections to the outside world more numerous than they were when Delilah Whaley lived and died. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of grandmothers and grandsons rest in those mountains, their stories intertwined in ways that refuse to be untangled, their legacy carried by descendants who know what happened and who will never tell. The mountains keep their secrets, but not this one. The story of the Whaley Widow has been told and retold through generations, passed from parent to child, sung in ballads that still bring shivers to those who hear them. It is a story about what happens when the state kills a child and protects those responsible, when a grandmother decides that such a death cannot go unanswered, when 23 wolves are released to do what no court would ever do. It is a story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about law and justice, about the limits of official authority, about what we would do if the state burned our grandchild alive and called it an accident. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Whaley Widow, who sent 23 wolves after the 2 soldiers who burned her Moonshine barn with her grandson inside, each victim dying in terror as the pack that she had spent 40 years creating tore them apart. The killings never prosecuted despite investigations that knew exactly who was responsible. A story of a grandmother's love and a grandmother's fury, of wolves bred for loyalty and trained for violence, of a 12-year-old boy who died in flames and the woman who ensured that his death would not go unavenged. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all.